I'm Dave Banks, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. In my full-time job, I work on Republican climate politics and policy. I know a lot of you might find that really interesting that there's a Republican working on climate policy and politics, but here you are, or here I am. Just to give you a little bit of context here, our moderator had to drop out this morning. Oh. Okay, so this is going to be kind of a hybrid, more casual affair. I'm kind of filling in as much as I can to help keep the conversation going. So I think that for the folks up here, let's keep, our initial remarks kind of short, concise, not more than just a couple of minutes. Okay. I do really want to have at least 10 minutes that we can sort of have a Q&A discussion with you guys, with the audience. And so with that, let's do like a quick round of intros, starting with you, Anne.
Great. So my name is Anne Mettler. I'm Vice President Europe at Breakthrough Energy. Breakthrough Energy was founded in 2015 by Bill Gates. In a nutshell, our mission is to help accelerate the innovations that can bring about the technologies that we need to get to net zero by 2050. However, I usually also speak from the perspective of my previous job, where I was a Director General at the European Commission, working for the previous president, Jean-Claude Juncker, and running the internal strategy department.
Hi there. My name is Allard Castelein. I'm the CEO of the Port of Rotterdam. Port of Rotterdam is basically an industrial facility with lots of maritime movements and activities. Predominantly an energy port. Some 13% of all Europe's energy is imported in Rotterdam. 50% of our throughput is fossil-based. We have a stated ambition to have a zero-emission port industrial facility by 2050, 55% reduction in 2030. Pursuing the various avenues to get there, together with industries, together with policymakers, local, regional, national, international, and clearly actively engaged in attracting the businesses that have a sustainable footprint. Thank you. Deborah.
Hi, I'm Deborah Lehr. I'm the Executive Director of the Paulson Institute. It's really terrific to be here and see so many familiar faces in the audience. I thank the Atlantic Council for putting on this really terrific event and putting a focus on what are some of the really important issues that we're facing, particularly around trade, as we'll discuss here. For the Paulson Institute, we are focused primarily on U.S.-China, but China and its global footprint as it continues to grow. It was founded by former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson. We're looking at a lot of the issues that we're talking about today around climate change, around trade, around biodiversity, and looking at how market mechanisms can be used to address these issues. In the context of today's discussion as well, I was at the U.S. Trade Representative for a number of years, focused on international trade issues, particularly related to China. So we've been following these issues. And I'm really excited about being on today's panel to talk about it.
That's great. Evita?
Hi, everyone. I'm Evita Moawad. I'm representing the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. I'm an international expert in sustainable energy and decarbonization. And so UNIDO's mandate is to support inclusive and sustainable development. And we are very much involved in the industrial decarbonization agenda through our convening capacity and normative function, as well as through technical cooperation projects. Thank you.
So why don't we do this? Because some folks out here may not quite know much about the climate and trade agenda. So I think it'd be good for the panelists to go through and just share why you're interested in the issue. What's driving it, right? And then I'll go last. Would you go forward, Anne?
Okay, so I thought I'd share with you today some of my thinking in my previous job, as I said, where I ran the strategy department in the European Commission, and we were asked to put forward proposals that should be taken on by this current European Commission. We put forward what is called the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, Why? So firstly, it was a climate objective. I mean, it became very clear that climate would become an overriding policy objective in this current commission. But I will also say it was a straightforward industrial policy, because what we, the situation we had in Europe didn't quite work for our industry, because we have a price on carbon through the ETS, the emissions trading system. So this makes producing in Europe quite expensive, even though, in fairness, one must say that the industrial companies in hard-to-abate sectors have been given free allowances. But nonetheless, I would argue that the production in Europe was quite expensive. At the same time, what did this do? It priced us out of the market. A lot of industries were leaving Europe. This is the famous carbon leakage. So it was just counterproductive for us, because we had these rules in Europe. It essentially incentivized companies to leave Europe, produce elsewhere under worse condition and less sustainable condition than had they been in Europe, and then import back into the EU. So, you know, watching this for a number of years, I came to the conclusion that something must be done about the trading system, that this is simply not sustainable, because we have a very powerful department for trade, so we kept our own markets wide open, which was oftentimes not reciprocated. And we didn't take the carbon intensity of the products that came into Europe into account. That, of course, as I said before, really meant an undue cost on European producers. And here I need to say both big and small, because we oftentimes think of big industrial plants, such as steel plants, aluminium, but this is also just to sell a garment in Europe, right? If you make a garment in Europe, it has to undergo a lot of due diligence. At the same time, because of e-commerce, we were flooded with Chinese products that came into Europe more or less unchecked, right? And there was even an additional element here because of peculiarities in the International Postal Union, which considered China a developing country. It was actually cheaper to send something from China to Europe than from Belgium, where I lived, to the Netherlands. So it was just completely counterproductive, this system, on all counts. And it led me to conclude that something must be done, because we were, of course, talking a good deal about sustainability, but we're not really practicing it. So it just, the system didn't work. However, if I look at just how this played out for some industry, Europe was an early leader in solar industry, completely lost its solar industry in less than 15 years, wiped out. The same is to some extent happening now in the wind energy, in the wind sector, wind turbines, where we were also early leaders, and is also in the process of being wiped out. We're seeing it play out in batteries. This was one of the actions I took when in my previous job, is to at least launch the European Battery Alliance, so that we would, you know, this is of fundamental importance to our automotive industry, that we, you know, have some capability to produce batteries in Europe. So we were able to catch up a little bit, even though there is not a single European battery producer under the global top 10. The same is now playing out in electrolyzers, which are critical to the emerging green hydrogen economy. So in industry after industry, it just didn't work for us. I'm sorry, you know. So this is why I put forward the CBAM, and it was essentially meant to be a race to the top. Europe is still the largest economy in the world. It is a major trading bloc. So the idea was to instill sort of what I describe as a race to the top, incentivize others. However, I have to be realistic and say that a couple of years later, I think Europe is now, unfortunately, too marginal to be imposing that unilaterally, which is why I am very supportive of the idea of a carbon club, which some of you may have heard about. So this is an idea that was then taken up under the German G7 presidency last year, is now part of the G7 agenda. I think this is promising. When the Americans, and I'm about to wrap up, when the Americans took down the steel tariffs on Europe, I think I detected the kernel of a carbon club, because as part of taking that down, the Europeans and the Americans made a commitment to produce higher standards for steel and aluminium. This was almost 2 years, or yes, this was quite some time ago. And I said, if the Americans and the Europeans produce a common joint higher standard for green steel and green aluminium, this has a potential to become a global standard, because the two geographies are significant enough that this would force others to essentially follow suit. It is to my huge disappointment that neither the Americans nor the Europeans have, in the meantime, followed up on this. It's a missed opportunity, because here is an agreement, a joint statement by the United States and Europe to do this. I hope that this can still be done, because we must at least try to raise some of the standards, because the current trading system, the way it is conceived now, will not lead to decarbonization unless we instill this race to the top and some sort of a coalition of the willing come together to set up some standards, at least for the products that with the highest CO2 footprint. So this is sort of my conclusion following these issues for many years.
And I totally agree. I mean, look, the current trade regime actually does the opposite, right? It rewards...
It's a race to the bottom.
Yes, it rewards bad behavior, right? Whether it's environment or labor standards. So thank you for that. Alan?
Yeah, so I'm not going to repeat everything Anne has said, because I also endorsed it. I think the addition I would like to bring to the table is that if you look at at Europe's sovereignty, if you look at what enterprises are looking for, it's kind of clarity on standards, rules, regulations, and a level playing field. And if either one of the two is not present, then there's a tendency to look for other solutions and potentially, in the current global environment, disappear. And I think that's one of the detrimental effects that we're currently faced with. And just take today's environment, given the energy prices, given the IRA, it is a factor 6 to 10, depending on the type of business you're in, where it's more favorable to invest in the United States, in decarbonization, in sustainability, in new processes that would allow you to tackle the market. So we have a kind of an existential question at the moment, certainly in Europe, in front of us, is that what kind of industry do we wish to embrace, and what kind of society do we seek? Now, the other threat that comes on the back of everything Anne has said and these additional remarks is that we revert back to a plan economy. That we're going to have a Brussels or Dutch or Belgium or German assessment of these kind of industries are still welcome, and those kind of industries are too energy intensive and should not be placed here or there. And I sincerely hope we stay far away from that. So, but I said it would appear that the lowest common denominator at this point in time at the tables and the discussions in Brussels and national governments is, let's plan for what kind of society we would wish to create and welcome in the decades ahead of us. And I think we should go back to say, what are the standards and the outcomes that we seek? Zero emission in 2050, avoiding carbon leakage, and how do we ensure that there's a level playing field? And if we create that environment, and it would be kind of a missed opportunity if through coalition of the willing, and it might not be all of Europe, but it certainly should be Northwest Europe, and it should preferably be Northwest Europe with the UK and the United States. If we create such an environment, rather than to try and solve world hunger, I do believe that we may be able to safeguard and actually make the right decisions, get the right investments, and ensure that we both address, if you like, the relevance and the presence of the industries and the climate. Now, with regards to, and then I'll stop, with regards to that assessment of what's the value of having an industry within your country borders or your region or your area. I mean, so often you also hear voices that, oh, it's only 80 jobs in a head office or 150 jobs at that particular plant. But what people tend to forget and not talk about is the full ecosystem that sits behind that. There's a legacy of 40 years of research, development, innovation, co-creation, but there's all kinds of associated services connected to that presence, and it might be the lawyer or the technical advisor, but it may also be the gardener and the cleaner and the driver and you name it. So the ecosystem of allowing industries to flourish and to have a presence in your environment is phenomenally important to a society, to not become overly dependent upon other regions, which we may live to regret in 10, 20, 30 years from now, because politics, by definition, are unpredictable. So,
well, you made some really, really good points here. One of my favorite points was that you're kind of getting at this. Look, and you and I talked a little bit about this before we walked in here, is that, look, we're clearly moving towards industrial policymaking in the United States and in Europe and elsewhere, in part to catch up and to check Chinese economic influence in the global system. But there's a right way and a wrong way, and then you're flagging, what happens if you go the wrong way. And I think we would, probably you and I would certainly agree that if you can construct the right climate and trade regime, right, create the right trade market that rewards our industry for its performance, right? It's our high standards, our emissions performance, our labor performance. That's going to create the basis for more investments in the type of industries and strategic industries that we need. Yeah. Deborah?
Well, it's a very good jumping off point for my thinking, because it's very interesting how climate has changed a lot of the narrative around trade. So in the 1990s and the 2000s, we were focused on market opening, and that was going to raise living standards. We incorporated into that labor standards and many of these other issues. We're on the edge of a climate industrial boom. And we see massive opportunities. If you look at the trillions of dollars that are being raised in private equity companies now looking to invest in environmental goods and services. And an assessment Goldman Sachs did of the opportunities in China alone for environmental goods and services is a $16 trillion opportunity for the private sector. And China itself estimates it's actually closer to $25 trillion. It's massive. But when we start to look at what's happening then in the trade, even though average tariffs are around 6-7%, on environmental goods and services, tariffs are at least 35%. And we talk a lot about how climate is going to be the area where we have to find cooperation. We have to put some of the geopolitics aside. We have to find ways to work with China. We have to put together what that's going to look like. But as we dig a little bit under that, that's okay on the policy side and the scientific side. As we start to look into what's happening in trade, we're seeing an increase in competition. We're seeing trade being used as a weapon, trade being used to create protectionism, and certainly what we're seeing with the IRA, what we're seeing is the movements in Europe to start to protect their own markets. And we see this with the Chinese and how they're going in and subsidizing certain industries so that they can compete with the rest of the world, whether it's in EVs, whether it's in solar, how they've been able to leapfrog certain technologies. They knew that they weren't going to be competitive in a mainstream traditional auto industry, for example. So can they leapfrog into the new industry, make inroads at home, and then start to export those overseas? And so to me, what one of the biggest challenges is for policymakers is how do you take advantage of what we see as this great opportunity to basically grow our economies coming out of COVID, to find and take advantage of these trillions of dollars in opportunities that we see going forward without creating, quite honestly, these protectionist markets, which are only going to serve to further increase the cost, not decrease the cost of products that are in the environmental space. I mean, the fact that we can't even come together and find a way to create free trade zones for these 35% tariffs on environmental goods and services is just one indicator of the challenges that are ahead.
Well, thank you. Of course, the big tension here, right, is that China currently benefits from the current trade system, right? And then, so what we're looking to do is, I guess, to try to correct what we might consider to be the mistake of bringing a non-market economy, into the WTO, right? What kind of impact that's had on supply chains, as we all know, COVID, Ukraine has really put a lot of focus on all that. So, and we can get back to this later. So I'm sure you've thought about this as well. But, well, no, go ahead if you've got a response or any thoughts related to that. Oh, are you handing it to Evita? No, you, Deborah. Yeah.
Well, as one of China's WTO negotiators, of course, I might
We're
have
not
a
going to blame
particular
you.
view
We're
on
not
that.
blaming you.
But I do think, though, it's important that you have structure and rules. And that, I think, is what's important. I think the challenge is the WTO never evolved, right? And the WTO, from the time it was created, has not continued to grow to reflect what today's world looks like. And so it has failed in its own mission, and it has failed to bring, maybe not on the resolution and the legal side, but certainly in the ability to bring new rounds, and it's failed in delivering any kind of process on environmental goods and services, which is why we're seeing this protectionism, why we see these regional trade agreements, and one of the concerns is China is Russian. Well, we have a choice. Do we close our doors? Do we not join TPP? Do we not join some of these other agreements? Do we not pursue our own? Or do we find ways to upgrade those? In some ways, you know, we're a little behind on this. We as the U.S., I should say. I'm not.
Okay, Evita, hold on. You're sitting here thinking.
Yes,
you got a response.
But what I wanted to say is I think trade policy can never be seen in isolation and must be seen with what the Europeans would call the state aid regime, which is essentially a subsidy regime. And here what I would have to say is that sort of what you can't do, which is what Europe has done for a long time, is keep the trading system wide open. I mean, so we are, you know, open for business. Everyone can import into Europe. At the same time, have no visibility over essentially subsidies that are given elsewhere that make products superficially cheap and therefore non-competitive with our own products. Yeah. So here, I think where the WTO failed is in understanding all these dynamics. You know, that the state aid regime is highly interwoven with the trade regime, and enforcing some kind of transparency, because we now see the allergic reactions that the Europeans are having when the Americans announce what their subsidy regime is going to be, but essentially have been silent, you know, and non-reactive for well over a decade about subsidies that were given in an untransparent way.
Yeah, so that's our problem, is that we're too transparent in our subsidy policies.
This is how democracies function. They announce their plans, right? And this has become almost a liability because, as I always tell the Europeans, you know, it's not the Americans that have destroyed your solar, your wind industry. Right. Your battery industry. I mean, it's so we need to be crystal clear here about, you know, sort of the interlinkages between those two, I would argue.
Right. Evita.
Yes, I'd like to add on the point of the need to create a conducive environment and the prerequisites for markets for green products. So the implementation of trade policies such as the CBAM and other kind of policies like public procurement commitments from the private and the public sector, they create a market for green products. And this is through, for example, global initiatives such as the First Movers Coalition and the Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative. However, there is a need for consistency and availability of data on embodied carbon and harmonized standards, which was mentioned, harmonized standards on how the embodied carbon should be measured in these products and how it should be certified and disclosed. And UNIDO is leading some of the efforts on these issues through the coordination of the Clean Energy Ministerial's Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative. And by COP28, we intend to work with partners to develop harmonized product category rules for steel. And this is in line with the Glasgow Breakthrough Priority Actions for 2023. And these product category rules for steel would allow to guide how embodied carbon in steel should be measured and how it should be disclosed, as well as define common definitions low carbon steel and near zero carbon steel. This would allow to create, this would allow to have common understanding across stakeholders on what these products are, as well as the global benchmarking of these products. So this would enable, this would help reduce, this would help increase transparency across borders.
And by the way, and this is actually incredibly important. If you want to do a club, right, we're going to have to agree on how do you measure embodied carbon in trade flows.
Completely.
Right?
And can I say that club must also be open? So if I want to be crystal clear, if China has these high standards, China will be part of that club and should be part of that club.
Yeah.
We have an emerging transatlantic consensus on this end. But
and
so,
maybe to add on this point, you pointed it out, the emissions from maybe non-OECD countries are quite a high share of the current total emissions from the heavy industries. So in a way, if we want to get to net zero by 2050, there needs to be a wider cooperation. And on this point, UNIDO working with India, who's the host of the G20, to bring this industrial decarbonization agenda beyond the EU and the G7 countries. So just wanted to add on this.
So, and I totally agree. I mean, look, if we're gonna construct some type of international or plurilateral agreement, it has to be open. It has to be as inclusive as possible, that anyone can sort of meet, right? If they just meet the standards. So for me, the Republican climate policy guy, why did I land in this space? Well, and I've been working on climate policy now for a good, 20 years or so. And it's been, obviously, everyone knows the difficulties that Republicans have when it comes to climate policy. And I think that's largely because they looked at climate policy through the lens of the Kyoto Protocol, right? And what that would have meant to U.S. competitiveness and industry. So, how does climate policy impact U.S. competitiveness? Okay. So, with the trade system, right, I think there's a growing recognition in the United States that, the U.S. and the EU as well, and Japan, and no surprise, kind of the G7, the more developed countries, are amongst the cleanest in the world when you're talking about carbon efficiency of the economy, and it's true across all the major sectors of the economy as well. So when you see this data, then oftentimes the responses that I get from Republicans on the Hill is, on Capitol Hill is, why don't we monetize that? Why don't we use that emissions performance to be able to construct a new trade system, and you'll like this, with our allies. So there's a recognition we're not going to negotiate some global agreement on this, but there's a recognition that, hey, this is something that we could do, right, with the Europeans. The Europeans are all over climate. We need to recognize that this is a policy priority. I'm speaking from a Republican perspective. We have to recognize that in order to be able to work with the EU, we're going to have to come up with a policy that also addresses climate. And so looking at trade and integrating the performance piece on this has the potential to change the whole conversation in the United States on climate policy. So that's why I'm in it. I think it's got major potential. And another big reason for this is because of, and it's fun to work on a policy that checks a number of strategic objective boxes, right? So Republicans will look at this and go, you know what? We want to get those, we want to pursue a smart industrial policy. We want to bring jobs back to the United States. We want to bring the supply chain or key components of the supply chain back to the United States and our allies. We want to bolster our competitiveness, not only protecting our domestic industry. That might be one of the big differences between sort of Republican U.S. thought and European thought. It's not so much a defensive measure to guard against emissions leakage, for example. It's more of an offensive posture where we're trying to construct an international system that rewards our performance, right? so that we're gaining market share abroad. And by the way, there are these climate benefits and global emissions benefits associated with it. And Democrats, by the way, Democrats agree with all that too. They might talk about it differently, but they might lead with emissions leakage and, and global emissions, but they all agree on the same strategic objectives. So that's kind of where I am.
Can I just say there's an added element now, which is energy security, which at least in Europe is front and center. And here, of course, now that energy has become weaponized and has been weaponized, there's a lot of thinking around and linking renewables and emerging clean technologies with energy security. However, when you then look at the realities on the ground, I see that 90% of solar panels that are sold in Europe come from China. I see that 70% of wind turbines that are sold in Europe come from China. I see that most batteries come from China. I spoke about electrolyzers. So that then leads to what the Europeans call strategic autonomy, namely that essentially we have very high, ambitious renewable targets in Europe, and they have been made more ambitious as a fallout of the war. But if the production is essentially outsourced to a country that is not in your sphere of influence, that can have devastating consequences. What if China refuses to supply these wind turbines and solar panels, and we have no capability of doing that? So I think where Europe needs to be extremely careful, because we essentially outsourced energy, of sort of fossil energy, to Russia, we cannot outsource the clean energy to China, So there is something here around this, what we're discussing, industrial policy, and really where sort of the energy resilience will come from having at least some production capabilities reshored into Europe, the United States. I think this is what you guys have come to realize as well.
Yeah.
So it's reshoring, as well as the resilience comes from not being reliant on any, overly reliant on any one energy source, which is why we need to stand up some of these emerging technologies so urgently.
Yeah, and one of the problems that we had with the IRA, right, was that it wasn't focused on U.S. treaty allies as well, right? And I think that's something moving forward.
Yeah,
I think folks will give a lot more consideration.
Sorry. No, just again to build and contextualize. I mean, energy being weaponized is unfortunately has been the case for many years and many decades.
It's in a different
I'm unfortunately of an age
just
that I remember the oil boycott in the early 70s, and that's why Europe created strategic stock. We forgot to do that about gas.
Yeah.
We should have learned the lesson, and we should have read the books, I suppose. I believe the other beauty about sovereignty is, yes, you need to do whatever you can, but if we merge that with the clean challenge we have, the sustainable challenge we have, it's inconceivable that Europe will produce enough hydrogen itself. Inconceivable, whatever way you look at it, unless we go massive into nuclear. Now, that'll be a while before we get there, I suppose. Which means that we will have domestic production, maximize that, plus we'll have huge amount and quantities of imports. If we look at Repower Europe plans for 2030, at least 50% of the 20 million tons of hydrogen, clean green hydrogen, will need to be imported. Now, the beauty about hydrogen is actually that you can derive it from so many different countries and regions that you do not have an overly reliant position that you can create. Because we looked at the world on behalf of our Ministry of Economic Affairs, Norway, Scotland, Iceland, Portugal, Spain, but also Algeria, Morocco, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, the UAE, Oman, Saudi, Australia, Malaysia, and then I've forgotten Iceland and a couple of others. And you can produce it in these countries, and the US comes into the frame with the IRA. So there's plenty of opportunity, and via diversification of supply, you get security of supply. So yes, produce as much as you can domestically, accept the mere fact that you will have a global market environment. And then we go back to the trade issue. Global market environments like coal has been a global commodity, gas is a global commodity, oil is a global commodity, the oil products are a global commodity. And other energy sources should remain to be a global commodity, and hence we need to create a level playing field with the targets of sustainability incorporated.
Interesting. Deborah, do you have a response?
As we look at some of the policy issues we were talking about and looking at how we would like to reshore a lot of these things. And there's a lot of discussion in the Biden administration about patriotic capitalism. And how do we encourage American companies to be investing not only because they see it as a good investment opportunity, but because they see it as something that's patriotic for their country. And semiconductors is the one that's often held out as an example of that our companies should be investing more in the domestic semiconductor industry because it's an area where the U.S. should continue to be competitive. But the reality is our companies are not foundations, they're not not-for-profits, and so they are going to be driven by where they're going to be able to get their profits. Yeah. And so again, how do we line up policymakers with these then very accurate concerns that Anne was talking about not being over-reliant on one country? And it's very difficult, and that is something we haven't seen. We haven't seen lots of cooperation, even with our allies. As I look at, for many years, in the 1990s when we were doing intellectual property rights negotiations with China, which was the big issue, we would work very cooperatively with our European colleagues. But when we turn around sometimes for some of the sanctions and support, they weren't always there. And as this administration is working very cooperatively, I think, with the Europeans, we do have situations where we find then some of the leaders are immediately going to China, is beginning to open up and taking their companies and talking about cooperation in these areas. We understand what's driving that, but it makes it very difficult to come together around a set of principles. And so what are those institutions? What are those entities? And it's not something that's going to be driven overnight, but we do have to find ways, because on its own, industry isn't going to be doing this. Industry may be a driver in the innovation. Industry may be a driver in what some of the solutions are going to be around climate change, but they are going to go where they can commercialize their products, which is China. They're going to go where the Chinese are going to go where they're competitive. And I'll tell you, I also head up a consulting business, and I can't tell you how many Chinese companies I've met with recently who think they're coming to the United States to take advantage of the IRA. It's just a huge irony, going back to the point on subsidies, which we've tried to address. So.
Well, you make a really good point too. I think a lot of the conversation that we have is, how does this impact? So, for example, when we're talking about climate and trade policy in Washington, back in Washington, how does this impact our relationship with developing countries? How are the Chinese going to react? We're not thinking enough about our allies, right? How, because we could certainly, as we've seen with IRA, we could certainly pursue some type of unilateral action, right? And by the way, and that's not, at least the current conversations on the Hill are all about the club, right, and working with our allies. But if this goes the wrong way, it's going to be detrimental. It's going to undermine the alliance structure. Anne?
I just wanted to sort of share a cautionary tale about what happened in Europe with solar, because one of the consequences of the oil crisis of the 70s, yes, was the strategic stock, but it was also that we really tried to get going, particularly with solar, but also wind. But if I look at solar, massive subsidies were given in Germany at the time, particularly in Germany, the so-called feed-in tariffs. These subsidies were also open to any country, and it essentially got the Chinese going on solar. They had access to the same subsidies as any German company. It gave hard currency. It gave expertise, and it gave a lot of sort of intellectual property, right? I mean, so, and it was actually towards the end that German companies were arguing to lower the subsidies because they could tell that they could not be competitive in this environment anymore as long as the subsidies kept flowing that generously also to Chinese companies. That is why one of the conclusions that I draw from all of this is that subsidies only where there is reciprocity. So the moment that American companies can go to China and get the same subsidies as Chinese companies, yes, but not any other way. We saw this when I worked at the European Commission on public procurement. So in public procurement, Europe is mandated, both in Europe as well as externally. And Europe is the largest donor of overseas development aid. So we also spend a lot of money externally. we are mandated to always take the cheapest offer. Well, guess where that comes from?
Yeah.
But
You think that the Belt and Road functions under the same, that the public procurement in China is as open to our companies as the public procurement in Europe has been the other way around. So my point is the whole system can only work if it is really based on reciprocity, transparency, if there are some rules that everyone follows.
Right.
Otherwise, you have a recipe for disaster. And I have had a front row seat for well over a decade now of this. It's not working.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, one thing I can, sorry, just to make one little point, one thing I can guarantee you, there are a few things that Republicans and Democrats agree on in Washington, but it is a strong position against China, and there's already legislation under consideration to make sure no Chinese company would be able to take advantage of the IRA.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm slightly worried about terminology like patriotic capitalism, because there's a very fine line between patriotic capitalism and protectionism.
Yes.
And I fully agree with Anne as well. I'd much rather, I sincerely believe that free markets operate in the best possible manner if the regulations are clear, strict, and fair and even. So the hypothesis that you can only have free markets if there's no sets of rules, it just doesn't fly. You need a very clear set of regulations that is fair and equitable to each and every one that needs and wishes to participate in that market, and you get free markets. And then you have potentially the Chinese coming to the US, but within the same rules of the game, rather than have within their own rules of the game. And you do not thus destroy solar business because it's not, the reciprocity is not there.
But what are the rules of the game in China?
So that's what I mean to say. If part of those rules of the game could be, you can only enter if your markets are just as open as ours are. So that's also a rule.
Yeah.
My statement.
But then let's have that rule.
But my worry is at this juncture that we all look at our own sets of rules and we revert back to protectionism. You see left, right, and center. US first, Australia first, Europe sovereignty. And truly, from a global perspective, that is not the way forward.
Well, let's hear our friend who works for the UN. What do you think about this?
No,
Is this a concern?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that didn't come up in the conversation is the impact of policies like the CBAM on developing countries that are currently exporting to Europe, and how they are going to make the transition, how it's impacting their businesses and how they're going to make the transition, and the need for technical cooperation programs and technology transfer and financing towards to enable the transition.
So that is an important concern. I mean, so this is another thing that we've talked about and trying to figure out how do we treat developing countries in this type of system, because we don't want to create a scenario where China uses that as a wedge, right? That drives a wedge between the U.S. and developing economies. But the problem I think that we have is that, so we don't, at least in the current conversation, we don't support any kind of exemptions for developing countries, because, and we've learned this through trade policy, that China will find that loophole, right, and move its operations, to the places to circumvent the tariffs. So this is, but we do agree that we need to make sure that this system is as fair as possible. And then one of the questions too that we have is how much will this actually affect developing countries, because it all depends on what the covered goods are, right?
I'm sorry, but I think we also need to see that there is a lot of opportunity at this current moment for emerging economies. I am personally convinced that we will see new energy superpowers, or at least energy powers, emerge in North Africa because of the abundance of sun and wind in that geography. Chile for critical minerals, Brazil, India is going really big on green hydrogen. My point is the global geography of energy is currently completely changing, and I actually see a lot of opportunity for emerging economies that frankly hasn't existed before. And so, yes, the CBAM can be maybe protectionist to some, but it cannot take away from the fact that climate policy has always been bedeviled by this collective action problem, that those that were the first movers, and Europe was a first mover, really sort of encountered significant cost because the trading system was not set up to deal with this.
Right.
So my point is, rather than focus now, oh, the Europeans can't do the CBAM because, you know, it may discriminate against some, you know, of these developing countries, then let's think about how can we help these developing countries raise their own standard, because the future is not in dirty technologies, in dirty sources of energy. So this is where we really need to sort of strategically think about this. And I personally see opportunities now. Morocco can be a major player. Egypt can be a major player. This has never been the case.
Well, and you can develop a design as well that actually accelerates private sector and state-owned enterprise investments, right, in greening supply chains in these, you know, in developing countries. So that's a good place to. Let's do a very short reaction. If any of you guys have a short reaction to what Anne was saying, and then we're going to open up questions, Q&As for the audience.
I can only confirm. I mean, many of the countries I just mentioned, that entire list of countries that we've engaged with, they have very promising prospects to develop a hydrogen economy, not only locally to set their economy off on the right pathway, but also to become an export country and to be part of a global network of activities. The technology is no rocket science. Institutional capacity is the challenge, right? They have no legislation, no trademark, no history, no taxation, no academia educated, so the ecosystem that we need to build that up very quickly, otherwise they will again be left behind. And that's my worry, because if you were to put money on it, it's very likely that those countries that have a legacy in the extractive industries will be first mover. And it's again not the developing countries, because they do not have the legacy, they do not have the capacity, they do not have the institutional capacity, and we need to develop that institutional capacity rather sooner than later.
Thank you.
I completely agree. I mean, to me, what are the vehicles for creating that structure, and how do you do it? You know, obviously the UAE is hosting COP this year. It's going to be a really important one. Is this a vehicle for bringing not just sort of the governments together, but really the private sector, who's going to be critically important in delivering on action? And the private sector has shown that, as we've seen during COVID, it really was the one who was finding the solutions. And just to plug Edelman just a little bit, we're putting out a trust barometer next week that we track, and overwhelmingly, out of the 4 institutions that we track on trust, business, government, NGOs, and media, business by far is looked to as the most trusted institution of delivering, and particularly on climate change.
Great. Interesting. Thank you. Evita?
Well, I mean, not a new point, but we had some consultations a few months ago with countries from Latin America, Asia Pacific, and Africa on this issue of decarbonization, industrial decarbonization. And it is a concern. These consultations included the public sector, people from government and from companies in the steel, cement, and chemicals industries. And there is a concern on institutional capacity, because many countries don't have really, as of now, like data on carbon emissions, so they don't have a full carbon inventory. And at the same time, there is, a need and desire for collaboration and partnerships on technology transfer.
No, thank you. So let's turn to the audience if you guys have any questions. Oh, you went first and then you second.
I guess this is a question to Anne and Deborah.
Can you introduce himself?
Could you introduce yourself?
Sorry, George Frampton. I work at the Atlantic Council. About what you think the chances are and the desirability of the US-EU steel and aluminum discussions actually morphing into a replacement for the CBAM or a piece of a carbon arrangement. And I ask that because while those discussions got off to a pretty slow start, and there was some doubt whether the Biden administration was really that interested in the decarbonization part of it as opposed to standing down from Trump tariffs. Nonetheless, the U.S. has now made a proposal which sounds not public, but sounds very relevant to trying to combine decarbonization and trade. And on the other side, the EU leadership is pretty committed to the CBAM, and it's not clear that they're all that sympathetic either to the carbon arrangement, nor are the Japanese as the G7. So how do you feel about these discussions becoming a part of a G7 a carbon arrangement or climate arrangement that would begin to change the CBAM before it actually goes into effect in a couple of years?
No, thanks, George. Anne, you go first, and then Deborah, if you can.
Well, I said that sort of my own trajectory has been from having been very much in favor of the CBAM and actually having proposed the CBAM to now being convinced it needs to be a carbon club, it needs to be open to everyone. The G7, I know that Japan is potentially lukewarm vis-a-vis the carbon club, but nonetheless have embraced it now. I mean, it is part of the G7 agenda. Honestly, I think we need sort of a little bit of trial and error, going back to the previous point that was made. I mean, you actually can't sort of manage what you can't measure. So if we take just a few products that really are very carbon CO2 intensive, yeah, such as steel, such as cement, such as aluminium, and just try, you know, and maybe it's not as part of a carbon club, but if the Europeans and the Americans do it, I guarantee it will have a global footprint, because both of those markets are big enough to essentially spearhead something that would then have the potential to bring others along. So, I mean, this is the race to the top that I spoke about. We will never know unless we try. It is part of the EU-US joint statement, and I think they should just get going on it, you know? I mean, I don't know what we're waiting for. And this is, I remember when I read it, I wrote to the colleagues in the US, I said, here is the kernel of the carbon club. It's happening. It's huge.
Thanks, Anne.
And now, you know, we're still waiting for
Deborah,
it.
do you have a...
I guess one of the things we have been proposing as just a baby step at the Paulson Institute is why couldn't the US and the EU come together and create a free trade agreement for environmental goods and services? And why can't we agree to eliminate tariffs? And just as a first step, and as you say, we see it as something that would be energizing. And if China wanted to join or any other country wanted to join, the terms are very clear. If you're willing to reduce those 35% tariffs, you can join the club.
No, thank you. I think we got time for one more question. It was, oh, yes.
Niklaus Schulze, Client Policy Chair at Edelman Global Advisory. This is the country that will indeed host COP28, so I'd like to turn back to climate policy. So the IPCC report says we've only got about 3 years left, well actually 2 now, to stabilize emissions and 7 years to cut emissions by 50%.
So does 1.5, right?
To remain on the 1.5 trajectory. So being the devil's advocate, I mean, does it really matter where we get the solar panels from and the wind turbines from, as long as they're as cheap as possible and we can deploy them as quickly as possible to remain on target?
Good question. So you want to keep it really tight? We're going to get the hook here in about a minute or two.
I think the businessman should answer.
Yeah, well,
Does it really matter? I would agree with you that we should not now prolong negotiations for 10 years and set up tariffs to such an extent that those solar panels cannot be used. But let's not forget that the challenge is so huge that an and approach is probably the only appropriate approach. So yes, we should continue to import as of today for tomorrow, while we also want to ensure that in 10 years' time we have a viable economy and a prosperous continent. So it's an and approach as far as I'm concerned.
great. Well, thanks again, everyone, for joining, and thanks to the panelists for kind of being spontaneous and kind of going along with the flow, with the change. Thank you again, and thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.